Welcome to this week's Humanities Forum. My name is Raymond Hain. I'm a member of the Philosophy Department here and the director of the forum. The forum exists to provide regular opportunities most Fridays during the semester to engage in reflection on the humanities as a campus community. There's a special focus on integration with the DWC program, and each semester there's 2 or 3 lectures that are thematically connected to a topic that might be considered in DWC classes that semester. Today is the second of 3 events connected to Shakespeare's English history plays. I'm glad to see you all here. I know some of you are thinking about Shakespeare's history plays in class. And now please join me in welcoming to the podium Brother Jordan Zajac, currently with the chaplaincy here on campus, but also a Shakespeare scholar who received his Ph.D. in Shakespeare Studies in 2013 from UMass Amherst.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. Brian Walsh. He comes to us from Boston University, where he is a senior lecturer in the Arts and Sciences writing program. And among his numerous publications, Dr. Walsh is the author of Unsettled Toleration, Religious Difference on the Shakespearean Stage, published by Oxford University Press in 2016. And he's the editor of a critical edition of a play entitled The Famous Victories of Henry V, which is an anonymous English history play and the only dramatic source for Shakespeare's plays about the reigns of Henry IV and Henry V. And it's a critical edition forthcoming in the Rutgers Anthology of Early Modern Drama. Dr. Walsh is also the author of a monograph entitled Shakespeare, the Queen's Men, and the Elizabethan Performance of History. This 2009 publication from Cambridge University Press won Dr. Walsh the Samuel and Ronnie Heyman Prize for Outstanding Scholarly Publication from Yale University. It was an extraordinarily helpful resource for me as I was writing about Shakespeare in my dissertation. So I was trying to think about the history as a genre, the historicity of genre, and the performative potential that history afforded Shakespeare and his contemporaries. And this important title, along with Dr. Walsh's continued work on early modern English history plays, is a major reason why he's joining us here today. Those of us who have been reading Shakespeare's histories together every Friday this semester are particularly happy to welcome him to the Humanities Forum for the value of his scholarship in this field. Those of us who have been reading in this reading group have already had the pleasure of berating him with our many questions earlier today over lunch. And I would ask you to please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Walsh now to speak to us on the topic Shakespeare and the Performance of History.
Good afternoon, everybody. Please let me know if you can't hear me at any point today during the talk. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Just closer. How's that? Okay, how's that? Good. All right, thank you. Thank you so much to Professor Hain for the invitation to this wonderful seminar, and thank you so much to Brother Jordan for the generous introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm just going to start with a very simple premise. A few years ago, I guess about 15, 16 years ago now in Shakespeare Studies, there was a very big book, important book published called Shakespeare as Literary Dramatist by a Swiss scholar named Lucas Erne. And one of the things he wanted to argue was, for years, people have assumed that, or people had sort of casually assumed that maybe Shakespeare didn't care so much about publishing his plays. He was just a man of the theater, and if his plays got published, it wasn't necessarily because he was doing it. Maybe his theater company was, or publishers just saw a way to profit off of it. Maybe even unscrupulous people were illegally pirating them, etc. And so he made the argument that if you read the plays carefully, they're so literary and they're so well planned and balanced that he always had an eye on publication, and that maybe even he deliberately had a strategy. And so this is part of a larger kind of history of the book intervention in Shakespeare Studies, where people got very interested in thinking about them as texts, talking about how things like, well, we know one of the lines that Lucas Erne says that I'm interested in is he talks about how the plays as we have them don't really tell us much about how they were performed, just how they were printed. We don't know. We don't have video. We don't have very few eyewitness accounts. The ones we do have are sometimes questionable in terms of how authentic they are. So the point of all this is to say, obviously Shakespeare, most of us get our access to Shakespeare through texts. Most of us read more Shakespeare than we see it performed live. Or if we see it performed, it's often again on film or a recording of some sort. So the very simple point is, I understand the pragmatism of that, saying, well, we have the texts, they've existed as 400 years as books, people read them alone in the study, you read an act, you put it down, you put notes in the margin, now you have Wikipedia and you Google something and find out a question you might have. And that's a very different kind of experience than sitting in a theater and watching a play unfold in real time. It's even different than watching something on video where you can pause it and stop and go back. And so the way in which I'm talking about the plays right now is really trying as much as possible to recapture that moment of them as performances before they were necessarily texts, when they were live events that Elizabethan audiences would go to. And I'll get to this a little bit toward the end. It's hard to generalize about that because we have so little evidence about it. Again, that's why I think there's been a lot of momentum toward thinking about history of the book in relationship to Shakespeare, because we know a lot more about the development and publication of texts than performances. But I'm going to spend a lot of time just trying to imagine and recall the simple fact of the original condition of these plays as live performances before an audience. So that's just a simple starting point. So let's begin near the beginning of the Western tradition, when Odysseus recounts meeting his mother in the underworld. And I, my mind in turmoil, how I longed to embrace my mother's spirit, dead as she was. 3 times I rushed toward her, desperate to hold her. 3 times she fluttered through my fingers, sifting away like a shadow, dissolving like a dream, and each time the grief cut to the heart. This moment has plenty to tell us about the pathos of Odysseus's life and journey, about the intensity of personal grief, especially concerning the primal mother-child relationship. But the passage has always struck me as also a neat little exemplum about the human relationship to the past in general. So William Camden and his proto-archaeology in Shakespeare's time helped introduce the English to a material sense of the past. That is a relationship to the past mediated through objects. Old coins, armor, remnants of buildings and monuments. Notice those things and kind of build up a sense of history around that. But this passage here speaks to a more long-standing conceptual sense of the past, one based on longing for what is immaterial, what's ghostly and vanished, the people, the events, the past time itself. Here we see an intense desire for the irretrievable. And my suspicion has always been that the general cultural desire for history is tied up with this desire to be able to grab hold of the past in some very basic way. The importance of history, we all know and we're often taught, is usually said to be that it offers us object lessons for what to do, and especially what not to do, as in mistakes not to repeat. But I think the passion for history as an academic discipline and as an object for literary speculation through the various genres of historical art is at its heart an elaborate cultural expression of Odysseus's attempt to embrace the dead. So fast forward now to Shakespeare's time. In his 1589 treatise, The Art of English Poesy, a writer named George Puttenham diagnosed the limited ability of humans to perceive history at all. The past, according to Puttenham, is that which, and this is a quotation, we are not able to attain to the knowledge of by any of our senses. Past is something we can't attain the knowledge of by any of our senses. For Puttenham, then, history is defined by its inalienable absence. It exists only in forms of textual or pictorial representation, such as prose works, poetry, illustrations, and embodied acts such as storytelling and theatrical playing. Now, in 16th century England, these forms flourished as varying responses to a heightened awareness of the absence of history, an awareness that the intellectual ambitions of the Renaissance precipitated. The historical culture of 16th century England exhibited a heightened sensitivity to the break between the past and the present, or to what a scholar named Andrew Escobedo has called the temporal caesura of historical distance. As he argues, 16th century English historical consciousness evinces his quotation as a hankering after knowledge of its origins, yet nonetheless is predicated on isolation from those origins. Now, the Shakespearean history play grew out of this emergent historical culture, and these plays in turn helped to shape a unique historical outlook. Of all the forms of history, performance alone supplies the pretense of sensual contact with the vanished past through the bodies that move and speak on stage. And the historical consciousness I see at work on the late 16th century stage comprehends the pleasures of history as rooted in a dialectic of presence and absence, where the performance of history provides a fantasy of pastness through a form that is necessarily ephemeral. History plays by Shakespeare contribute to Elizabethan historical consciousness by highlighting historicity as a sense of discontinuity, understanding the difference between past and present, and all the while reflecting on strategies through which historical representation tries to address and maybe even amend that discontinuity. The history play in the Age of Shakespeare was a response to varied developments of the 16th century. As a historical phenomenon, it sits at the intersection of several social, political, literary, religious, and technological innovations and movements. And the dominant critical response to these plays in the 20th and 21st century has been to examine them primarily as registers of the era's politics. The history play through this lens becomes a means to understand how Elizabethan playwrights, especially Shakespeare, understood, commented on, perhaps tried even to intervene in everything from Elizabethan foreign policy to the looming succession crisis that many assumed would erupt after her death, to debates over the legitimacy of the Tudors or of the monarchy itself. This critical focus makes sense. The plays elicit such a response from us by foregrounding key questions about government and the uses of power. It's hard to read these plays without intense speculation about how contemporary authorities and audiences might perceive them, or to wonder whether Shakespeare was more conservative or more radical in his own thinking. And we do know that history was expected to be topical, often written as a means to comment on the present. This is a tradition in historiography, of course, that can be traced back to the Roman historian Tacitus, and was picked up and imitated specifically in some Elizabethan historians in their translations of Tacitus. We know certainly about, and we were just talking about this at lunch, an infamous intersection of topical uses of history and Shakespeare's plays. The command performance of Shakespeare's Richard II that the Earl of Essex arranged. So as we were just talking about, you'll recall that in 1601, he paid Shakespeare's company to put on a performance of the play Richard II at the Globe Theatre. Scholars usually interpret that episode as Essex's attempt to garner support for his mini-rebellion against Elizabeth by suggesting that he was a latter-day Bolingbroke, a righteous noble pushing aside a corrupt, ineffectual monarch in decline, or at least her corrupt advisors. Elizabeth, of course, is reputed to have commented on the failed uprising, saying, "I am Richard II, know ye not that?" In other words, that I'm sort of the target of this reference or play. This tragedy was played 40 times in open streets and houses, and you can only imagine how many pages have been spent of scholars trying to parse what exactly that means, of the tragedy, streets, houses, how literal is she talking about playhouses, et cetera. So there's a lot of, but if we just take it as a common sense response here to something about this, or there's also people who wonder whether she ever really even said this, et cetera. But if we just take it for now, on its face, it's not for nothing then that Shakespeare scholars have looked to the history plays to gauge how Shakespeare and his audiences, including the Queen herself, use the past to negotiate the politics of the present. Now, I'm nothing but respectful of that line of inquiry, but when I first started to think about and write about the history play as a genre, I became convinced that there was more to the story of what history plays could do and about how they worked in particular, what their affect might be. And by affect, that can sound like sort of a jargony word, but I just really mean a common sense definition of how they touch the feelings in a sort of visceral way for playgoers. What is it that people find compelling about them? Political intrigue is compelling. That can make for pleasurable narrative. But beyond that, what are the pleasures, entertainment factors of history? Why do we want to go to a history play? Why would anyone want to watch represented history? What's exciting about it on that sensual, visceral level? I don't think the kind of pleasure I'm talking about needs to be strictly separated from appreciation of political intrigue, or even from learning something like a moral lesson. It's not one or the other. But I've sought, in my work on the history play, I have sought to isolate the, we could say, sort of conceptual pleasures of history a bit, isolate them a bit, in order to think about the idea of performing history on stage and what it offers us. So today I want to devote my remarks to Richard III. So some of you I know have read that recently and discussed it, and so I apologize if it's sort of overkill about that. We spent a lot of time talking about Richard II this afternoon, now Richard III. But I think the play demonstrates something important to our understanding of history plays, how performing history offers a certain pleasurable self-consciousness about history as a human construct. Being self-conscious about history as a construct might seem like the first footfall down that proverbial slippery slope to some kind of relativism. But I hope to show how that's not the case here, especially with a play as pointed in its depiction of tyranny and evil as Richard III. Richard III, I believe, addresses head-on questions about historiography, that is the branch of history about history as an idea and a practice, and uses its own form, theatrical performance, to give us pleasure and fantasies of access to the past, and to remind us that history is not just produced, but received. I think the play balances its depiction of history as pleasurable imagining and play acting of what is irretrievable, with an emphasis on the ethical obligations of how we respond to narratives of the past. And I want to suggest that both of these perspectives are rooted in recovering our sense, as I spoke at the beginning, recovering our sense of the history, that the history play was conceived to be a species of performance. So moving now into Richard III. The young Prince Edward arrives in London, and he's told that he's going to be staying at the Tower, right, which is sort of a movie soundtrack, you'd get the scary music as soon as he sees the Tower, right? This is bad news. But he exhibits two different kinds of historical curiosity about it. He starts by asking, did Julius Caesar build the Tower? And he said that he did. So, but he eventually goes on to ask, how do we know that he built the Tower? He's interested in both the facts of history, did Julius Caesar build the Tower, and the process by which, what the processes which make historical knowledge possible. So how do we know whether he did? This is an odd exchange. It's one of these moments in which Shakespeare isn't being especially efficient about plot, and so that's one of those moments where you kind of want to wonder what is it that he's doing by having this exchange there. And it's the most explicit reflection on practices of historiography. In one view, it signals a critical historical sensibility on the part of the prince, who questions the evidence about the Tower and wants to compare its various historical traditions. And the conversation also opens up the pregnant topic of written versus oral history. The prince is initially confident that reported or spoken history is sufficient to last for all time. And that's where the quotation cuts off here, even to the all-ending general day. But as the conversation continues beyond what I've quoted here, he eventually affirms that it's Caesar's wit set down, that is in writing, the written narrative of his deeds that guarantees his long-term fame. The prince's conclusion is supported by the evolving historical culture of early modern England, where the proliferation of print histories in the 16th century gradually marginalized and deauthorized oral history. And in the long run, written wins out, of course. Today, I think we tend to trust books more than what some guy on a park bench might tell us about some important historical event. The context of these lines being spoken in a play about the past prompts us to consider further where dramatic performance, this oral, visual form of representation, fits into that binary of written or oral history. I think that Richard III shows how theatrical form exceeds that binary. The play is ultimately, I think, ambivalent about the relative merits of history that's delivered through writing or speech. I don't have time to go through all of this in detail, but I think it ultimately sort of undermines both at different moments, undermines the reliability of written words, but also of spoken, and offers theater as an alternative vehicle to experience narratives about the past. Richard III suggests a conceptualization of history through theater in which the past is eidetic. That's my definition for that from the Oxford English Dictionary. Right? Applied to an image that revives an optical impression with hallucinatory clearness, or to the faculty of seeing such images. A history is posited as a kind of visual memory, so that the historical imagination comes to be modeled on the experience of stage plays. Richard III contains an awareness that it is part of a series of plays that have led up to it, and the so-called first tetralogy. And a pervasive motif of its discourse on history is reference back to those previous plays. So this theatrical sense of the past is most evident by the play's end. There you have a scene depicting that's the eve of the climactic battle, where Richard III, the play features a representation of history in the form of ghosts, back to where we started with ghosts, who appear at Bosworth Field. Insofar as ghosts are a well-established convention of the popular stage, that scene conflates theatrical technique, theatrical machinery with historical knowledge. They sort of become imbricated. This is something like what we see in a famous comment on the hero Talbot in Shakespeare's play One Henry VI, which is the first play of the so-called first tetralogy. This is a commentator, so one of those rare moments where we think we have someone actually saying what it was like to be at a performance of a Shakespeare play. Thomas Nash, in a book called Pierce Penniless, his supplication to the devil says, 10,000 spectators at least, at several times, imagine they behold him. This is this hero from the English past, Talbot. 10,000 spectators at least, at several times, imagine they behold him fresh bleeding. That's what the power of theatrical performance of the past is. The sense that this past figure is revived and people can imagine that they see him. That idea of entangling historical and theatrical knowledge. Talbot is intertwined with the tragedian who plays him. The Afterlife of Richard III, which is a much better known play to us today, both in the wake of its initial performances and in the long-term history of its reception, has been a deepening of this effect. It's become an exemplary case in which a figure from history is inseparable from their dramatic connotations. So the third play in this series of Henry VI plays, is called the third part of Henry VI. That's, again, a relatively obscure play for us today. But it was very well known in the 1590s and very important to Richard III. The third part of Henry VI, in a sense, is the past of Richard III. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Characters throughout Richard III remind audiences of events depicted in that previous play, repeatedly. And that play is one we can reasonably assume most of Shakespeare's play-going audiences would have seen or been familiar with. It was a very popular play. If you were a playgoer, you probably saw that too. And it resonates in Richard III as a series of vividly described memories of previously staged events that the characters share with audience members. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just an example of, in Richard III, moments in which characters specifically cite moments that were enacted on stage in another play. So they keep saying, remember when this happened, and you did this, and you did that. And these are all things that were done in a previous play. Keep reminding the audience at the present performance of Richard III of this past play. Remember that image of Richard stabbing Henry at Tewkesbury. Remember that image of Edward, who I stabbed, etc. Richard III contains the awareness that it is part of a series of plays, and a pervasive motif of its discourse on history is referenced back to them. The theatrical sense of the past is most evident. Oh, I'm sorry. So the sum effect of these references are that Richard III transforms its predecessor from the status of a past play, or even a play about the past, to the status of the past itself. If you're in the audience of a performance of Richard III, then the past becomes the third part of Henry VI. That's kind of the real past that the characters in front of you have as their common sense of what came before. Now, the allusions to the third part of Henry VI surely could help playgoers who did not see that play make sense of Richard III. So I want to hold out that possibility. It could help make Richard III more self-contained. But I think they more insistently activate memories of audiences that did know that history, that previous play. So the history of Richard III, the past that it posits as real, is a narrative that's self-consciously constructed out of previous performances. So this is subtle. It's a web of references in the heat of the plot of Richard III as it unfolds that steadily builds up 3 Henry VI as the remembered past, so that historical memory and theatrical memory are merged. This merging is less subtle later in the play, in Act 5, Scene 3. And I'm just going to kind of describe this scene just to make sure for people who aren't familiar with it. This is a scene of the night before the final battle, the climactic battle of the play. And so Richard and his men enter from one side of the stage, and Richmond, his antagonist, and his men enter through the other side. And they each have distinct conversations. And the basic idea here is anybody who's at all literate in what it means to attend a play is you immediately understand that they're supposed to be on one side of a field, they're on the other. Even though they're just standing a couple feet apart from each other on the stage, we imagine this great distance. They're on either side of the battlefield. Their conversation alternates between them. They discuss battle plans on different ends of the stage, and then at some point, Richard and Richmond both go to sleep. And then a ghost of Prince Edward Lancaster, who's referenced in some of these moments here, emerges and speaks to Richard and then to Richmond. And this is this pattern. He comes in and they curse Richard and then bless Richmond, this pattern of what's going to happen in the battle. There are various verbal cues that indicate that they're intense. And there's the folio has a stage direction that says they withdraw into the tent. And modern editors generally interpolate stage directions that they are tense, are set up while the talking is going on. So building tents on stage and just the fact of split staging is a dramaturgical strategy. Shakespeare foregrounds the theatrical process through the split stage and through players visibly rigging up the tents for Richard and Richmond. Such action would signify how human labor transforms the stage space into imagined locales and distant temporal moments, how the historical past is made visible through the theatrical labor you see right on stage as they're building the tents. The work of the playwright and the players to construct the stage space is complemented by the work done to code the ghosts as ghosts. So ghosts were a feature of early revenge dramas, such as the so-called Hamlet, a posited play that people have referred to in terms of the ghost wearing a mask, and the Spanish tragedy. And there was most likely a convention of signifying how someone was known to be a ghost. So theater historians note records indicating everything from masks to makeup, white flour, sheets, etc. Importantly, as one scholar notes, and this is a quotation, in Shakespeare's source in Holinshed's Chronicles, Richard is said to have had a dream of images like terrible devils on the night before the battle. But there's no mention of ghosts. So in Shakespeare's historical source material for Richard III, they don't talk about him being visited by ghosts the night before. So this parade of the dead come back to life is entirely Shakespeare's creation. Shakespeare injects the exuberantly and even the deliberately anti-realistic into his portrayal of the past. So the appearances of the ghosts might at first seem like an instance of, and I'm using a philosopher Paul Ricoeur's definitions of different kinds of memory here. Oh, sorry, that's not right. Here. These are just more examples from Richard III about references back to the third part of Henry VI. But so the appearance of ghosts might at first seem like it's an instance of mnema, and this is how Paul Ricoeur defines that as a kind of memory about something just pops into your head, pops into memory, popping into the mind of a memory. In fact, though, the process is more akin to anamnesis, which is he defines as memory as an object of search. It is Shakespeare's fiction that ghosts visit Bosworth through their own volition, but history doesn't just materialize before us. For that, we have to go to the theater. History is something that's continually produced, as when the players, probably in makeup and sheets, that represent Prince Edward and King Henry, all the others, enter the stage to enact these figures. Cultures create and craft history, as the players create and craft the spectacle of ghosts and the split stage on which they can appear. In Richard III, the dependence of historical consciousness on the cultural production of theater is made evident both in the reliance on a previous play for historical knowledge and on the way the past is given a distinctively theatrical shape in the performance of the ghost scene. So Richard III, by its end, accomplishes a rendering of history that's self-conscious about the formal apparatus it uses to present the past. Lady Anne's initial question upon seeing Richard Gloucester early in Richard III can serve as a starting point to summation of some implications of this self-consciousness. So when Richard first enters, Lady Anne says, "What black magician conjures up this fiend?" So Anne's rhetorical aim is clear enough. She establishes that Richard seems preternaturally evil. But the query bears further scrutiny. So one answer to the question of Richard's origins is the historiographic tradition, starting with John Roos's late 15th century description of King Richard as an unnatural being, gestated for 2 years, was born with teeth and shoulder-length hair. This tradition would take its most influential form in Sir Thomas More's History of Richard, from which almost all the subsequent 16th century chronicles derive. This idea, again, of Richard as a monster. Another more immediate answer to Anne's question, what black magician conjures up this fiend, is Shakespeare himself. Or to be precise, the combined effect of author Shakespeare and the actor Richard Burbage. So obviously Shakespeare is on our right here, Richard Burbage on the left. This is one of the lead actor of Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlains, and then eventually King's Men. So this is the guy that might not look like it, but would have played Romeo. And any dashing lead figure in plays, and if you notice, as Shakespeare goes on in his career, you get an old guy like Prospero as the lead as he gets older, so some of the lead parts get a little older as well. So we assume he played most of the lead parts, Hamlet, etc., Othello, King Lear, you name it. This would have been the guy, Richard Burbage. So the Richard that confronts and seduces Anne over the corpse of Henry VI, no matter how much he might come out of the chronicles, in the present moment of the play's performance is peculiarly a creation of Shakespeare and his lead actor. We can just think about, I just mentioned Romeo and Juliet, how Shakespeare's version of things has tended to obliterate what came before it. So how much that kind of makes almost not irrelevant, but pushes to the side the tradition of histories about Richard III other than Shakespeare's. Think of something like, again, Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare didn't invent that story. He didn't invent the particular version of that story. He just gave us the most famous example of it. So nobody cares about Romulus and Juliet. You know, the poem that he bases it on. That kind of obliterates what came before it. The Shakespeare Burbage dyad and the play it produced has ensured that King Richard III endures as a creature both of English history and the Elizabethan stage, with a theatrical iteration of the king constantly informing historical representations of his reign. So thus a historical imagination is constructed by means of this theatrical point of reference. This produces the effect ultimately of linking the theatrical and the historical in phenomenological terms. The King Richard to which Shakespeare's play gives us access is always a surrogate for the genuine article, is always a professional actor. And the legacy of Richard III has been the intensification of this association between history and theater. So I emphasized earlier that theater is transient, just a simple fact. It comes, it goes, it's over. This basic reminder about how plays work emphasizes disappearance as a fundamental element of the performance event. It's there and then it disappears. While this is a model of performance analysis that I find useful in assessing the impact of live plays, some theorists have usefully begun to challenge it as an absolute in ways that I think are applicable here. And I have a flurry of quotation from a few different scholars. I'll just try to go through that. So this is one, Walsh, who says that critics who interpret the theatrical event as a form of absence center their attention on transience, and that when applied to the stage, the notion of unraveling temporality macerates, it's a nice word we don't see too often, but macerates performance into a succession of fading instants, from the not yet to the already gone. She acknowledges the truth of this approach, but seeks to modulate it as well, arguing that theater engages forces of becoming. That's what I really want to emphasize with this, forces of becoming, as well as those of vanishing. And then the next scholar is someone named Diana Taylor, who makes a similar point in her response to a theorist statement who says that performance's only life is in the present. And in response to that, Taylor says, performance makes visible for an instant live now that which is always already there, the ghosts, the tropes, the scenarios that structure our individual and collective life. These specters made manifest through performance alter future phantoms, future fantasies. Performances tap into public fantasies and leave a trace, reproducing and at times altering cultural repertoires. Performance, be it artistic or political, accomplishes a moment of revisualization. It disappears only to hover. And that's a key term I want to take away from that, the idea of performances disappearing but hovering. So Shakespeare and his performers have been remarkably successful in reproducing and altering cultural repertoires of historical materials. His King Richard III has in particular managed to hover, even as each individual performance of him disappears. The success of the play in the long run has guaranteed that Richard's story will be linked to the theater and professional play acting. What ultimately endures in the popular imagination of this king is the image of not just a stagey figure, but a stage figure, a stage-bound figure. So Richard III has become, in a sense, a locus classicus of florid acting, not in a way that just confirms certain perspectives on the performative nature of royal authority, but in a more literal association with aesthetic play acting. And this is evident in a series of contemporary and near contemporary references of the play, which call attention to that guy we just talked about, Richard Burbage, who acted King Richard, and who was probably the most famous player of his era. And so we'll just start with a very often cited body anecdote that makes this, the point of this isn't just to give a body anecdote, but to a serious point about Richard and Richard Burbage's association with the role. So this gossipy guy recorded in his diary, upon a time when Burbage played Richard III, there was a citizen grew so far in liking with him that before she went from the play, she appointed him to come that night unto her by the name of Richard III. So sort of a theater groupie, hangs around afterwards, goes to the lead actor and says that she wants to meet him, and his code word for getting into her house is going to be Richard III, the part he had just played. So Shakespeare, overhearing their conclusion, went before, was entertained, and at his game ere Burbage came. Then messaging brought that Richard III was at the door. Shakespeare caused return to be made that William the Conqueror was before Richard III. So whatever, again, this is an anecdote from 1601, was recorded in a diary in 1601. Whatever truth value we assign to this story in terms of Shakespeare or Burbage's biography, it does confirm an association between the actor Burbage and the role of Richard III. The play itself is linked to the professional theatrical milieu in the anecdote, constructing as it does a network of connections among playgoer, player, and playwright. Shakespeare in the story is armed with a mischievous sense of historical chronology and prevails here. But the more salient point of the anecdote is the way it links the two Richards, actor and historical figure. This can also be seen in, there's a play from the period, an academic play, something that was put on at a college called Return from Parnassus, that was also very gossipy about the theater industry. And so in this play, they have characters playing real-life figures from the Elizabethan theater industry. And so this is somewhere 1598, 1601. And so there's a character version of Richard Burbage, the actor, and another from Shakespeare's company, The Clown, Will Kemp. And they both appear there. In this play, Burbage meets someone who tells him he wants to be an actor. And Burbage says to him, well, I like your face for Richard III, which is not a compliment, I suppose, but I like your face for Richard III, and then says, let me see how you do it, and the guy immediately says, now is the winter of our discontent, may glorious summer, etc. So right away, Burbage is again linked specifically with this part, as though representation of Burbage necessitates mention of that role of his association with Richard III. The trend of associating the figure of Richard Gloucester with this particular professional player is perhaps best seen in a poem, Iter Boreale, by Bishop Richard Corbett. The work was published in 1647, but probably written as early as 1618, which purports to document a journey through England. So in his account of a stop to see Bosworth Field as a historical site, Corbett includes a witty description of a host, of someone who's showing him around the field, who he says was full of ale and history, who serves as a tour guide. I've met a few people like that at bars, people full of ale and history who serve as a tour guide. So, and here we have, the host could tell the inch where Richmond stood, this is written as a poem, where Richard fell. Besides what of his knowledge he could say, he had authentic notice from the play, which I might guess by mustering up the ghosts and policies not incident to hosts, but chiefly by that one perspicuous thing where he mistook a player for a king. For when he would have said King Richard died and called a horse, he Burbage cried. So retelling trying to give a historical account of what happened at Bosworth Field, instead of saying King Richard died, he said Burbage said a horse. The host is careful to give the relative positions of Richard and Richmond, a hint that his knowledge of the battle might have been prompted by a memory of that split stage scene we talked about. And he goes on to describe things like where they're sitting on the grass, and also the presence of the ghosts. He captures the epistemological crux of the situation, the real past known through a medium based on pretending, and that paradoxical phrase, authentic notice from the play. Authentic notice from the play. Corbett guesses that his host knows the Richard story through the play for a number of reasons. The ghosts, the allusion to the horse line, but his main evidence is the host's sense that the story is entangled with familiarity with it as existed in performance of Shakespeare's play, in his mistaking of Burbage for Richard, a player for a king, and his assigning to Burbage the famous lines calling for a horse. So Corbett's poem shows how performance of Richard III could have the effect of creating a historical sensibility that is entangled with theatrical memory. In an instance that conforms to a theater scholar, Joseph Roach's term, surrogation, and he defines that as the doomed search for originals through continually auditioning stand-ins. That's Roach's definition of surrogation, the doomed search for originals through continually auditioning stand-ins. The mediating figure, the stand-in, is the professional player, Burbage. The player is at once the vehicle for the fantasy of presence that performing history offers, and recognizable as a particular celebrity of the theater industry, marks the limitation of that fantasy, a sign that the perspective of the past is a product of theatrical labor. So, just a signpost where I am, King Richard III holds this enduring place in the popular imagination of the past as a hunchbacked figure stranded on a battlefield, missing his horse. And this is an image gleaned from Shakespeare's version of the play, which Shakespeare himself took from perhaps a hint from the Queensman's version of Richard III, the true tragedy of Richard III. There he just asks, he says he needs a fresh horse, but Shakespeare does something more with it. The consciousness of history that the play constructs then has a lingering visual component constituted by this player and his stage presence. And it's that very presence that allows Shakespeare's dramatic historiography to supplement the dominant modes of representing the past in Elizabethan England, the written or the oral. It helps to constitute a theater history analogy in which history is understood not merely as a narrative that is heard or read, but as having this oral ocular component, whose embodiment is experienced three-dimensionally by playgoers. It can thus work to constitute that eidetic or image-oriented sense of the past, one of becoming that hovers as part of the cultural memory, cultural repertoire. There's a 1741 William Hogarth painting based on the ghost scene in Richard III. And this is one visual afterimage that captures such hovering. That painting today hangs in the gallery in Liverpool, is titled David Garrick as Richard III. So this actor, famous 18th century actor, Garrick, part of the title is featured here. He just made a name for himself by acting the part. So the title of the work tips its hand towards its theatrical provenance for the image it depicts. As it indicates, it's an actor playing the part. And the painting makes a theatrical context for the scene ambiguous, though. So Garrick is not situated on a stage, right? This does not appear to be a snapshot of a moment from a theater production. Behind the tent is what seems to be kind of a realistically rendered battlefield, receding battlefield. The painting visualizes the historical event of Bosworth, but draws on Shakespeare's version of the Richard III story for this particular moment, the aftermath of the ghost's visitations. This is when Richard wakes up, and plugs an actor's face in for the historical Richards. So the use of Garrick, we could say, is a surrogate for Richard III, but maybe he's also a surrogate for Burbage as the surrogate for Richard III. Shows how Shakespeare's play could continue to blur the line between history and theater. Now, the Hogarth painting is an interesting example to consider, but in the end, it's a static image. More dynamic associations of this English king with acting and the stage have endured and can be seen in more recent examples. There's an episode of, this isn't recent anymore, I know, but Monty Python from 1970. So features a sketch where the doctor tours the Royal Hospital for Overacting and gives special emphasis to the Richard III ward, which is where he's in right now. The ward consists of actors particularly obsessed with declaiming Richard's last words, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. There's a segment from The Simpsons in 1995 where a superhero film is being shot in Springfield, and Bart Simpson wants to land the role of a sidekick, so he quotes Richard, "Now is the winter of our discontent," as his warm-up for his audition. Family Guy, another 2000 animated show from 2000, does the same thing with a child, using those lines as a way to audition for a play. There's a 1999 Spike Jones film called Being John Malkovich, a work peculiarly interested the psyche and persona of the performer and the relation between actors and roles. And in that movie, if you remember, Malkovich is shown rehearsing the wooing scene from Richard III, complete with a prosthetic humpback. So now George Buck, a early modern political theorist and historian, he began to recuperate the image of Richard as early as 1619, trying to say, no, he wasn't actually this monster, this is all Tudor propaganda, etc. But a late 20th century collection of essays assessing Richard's reign demonstrates how difficult such a project is, in particular in the wake of Shakespeare's representation of Richard as this essentially evil figure. The editor of that collection writes in his introduction that obviously it's impossible to accept Shakespeare's portrait of Richard. This is his quotation. Obviously it is impossible to accept Shakespeare's portrait of Richard as the evil genius whose malice and cunning overshadow the whole period from the first battle of St. Albans in 1455 onwards. Now this may be the consensus, obviously, among modern historians, but the very fact that the statement must be aired at the start of a study of Richard and his reign is telling. Later in the same collection, another historian argues that the following question is essential to Ricardian historiography. How much did a knowledge of Shakespeare's play influence, wittingly or unwittingly, later writers on the king? It's kind of a cliche of historians and scholars and teachers of Richard III to pose that question and try to get students to think about possible gap between the play and historical evidence as a means of introducing the study of that king. So obviously performance is the crucial factor that underwrites the persistence of Shakespeare's Richard. It's not merely Shakespeare's exquisite poetry or the force of his work as a text that has sustained the Richard of John Roos and Sir Thomas More and others against revisionist claims that suggest a different historical Richard. It's the Richard of More given a body, More and the others given a body and a stage to bustle on. That's a word Richard uses at one point for his kind of energetic moving through the world, to bustle on, that energizes and perpetuates this dialectic. The Shakespearean Richard demonstrates the power of theater as a form to shape the historical imagination. The persistence of Shakespeare's depiction of Richard III testifies to the experience of history the play delivers, an experience made intense by the performance tradition of the lead character that Burbage inaugurated, as well as the play's engagement with history as an idea, as in the Bosworth ghost scene. This phenomenon allows us to rethink, again, I think, that ancient aphorism about the didactic purposes of history. So there's a guy, 20th century historian of Tudor historiography, F.J. Levy, who has this quotation. He says, "History in the early modern period that did not teach was utterly inconceivable. And if any changes occurred during the course of the 16th century, these had not to do with whether history should teach, but with what it taught." And I think that there's a lot of truth to that statement, but I think also he leaves little room for how a genre might impact ideas of history, for thinking, for instance, about performed history as an experience rather than merely as a vehicle for education. But I think theatergoers in Elizabethan London found and wanted to find more in stories about the past than moral lessons. One thing they gained was pleasure in the fantasy of access to the past as an imaginative triumph over the tyranny of time and space. So Richard III, throughout its history, has stood as an example of the fate of tyrants, the evils of political cunning, and it's also equally, if not more prominently, been received as a play in the popular imagination that defines an archetype of the theatrical thrill of performing the historical. Through its use of another play, 3 Henry VI, as the materials of historical memory, through its own persistent indulgence in the language of the theater, and its ultimate emergence as a star vehicle for a professional actor, Richard III offers a consciousness of history as produced by the labor of those working in the theater industry, a fact that's been amplified by the long association of the play's leading part with ostentatious acting. As audiovisual spectacle, featuring the desirable bodies of star players, Richard III is sensual history. As a commercial play, its history is vendable product of human labor. Formally, it represents a means of representing the past. And I think that last point is important to just linger over for a second, the idea that history was something people could make money off of through the chronicles, through plays, et cetera. It was obviously something that theater people put on because there was a market for it, which constructs an experience of history and reveals that experiences of history are always constructed. The play and its afterlife demonstrate the peculiar frisson of this dual work of presenting the past and promoting a critical consciousness of such presentations. I'm going to sort of skip to the end. I have a few more pages, but I don't want to push our time limit of 50 minutes as usual the experience. So I'm going to skip to the end, but I had a few pages in which I was going to think a little bit about. I'll just describe quickly the Scrivener scene in Richard III. This is where a guy comes out and says he's just produced a document that authorizes the execution of somebody. But that person, they started trying to authorize it before the person was ever arrested or accused of a crime. And what he's talking about is, the quotation he says is, "Who is so gross that can't see this palpable device, yet who's so bold but says he sees it not?" And so this idea that this guy comes out and says, we all know that something's not quite right here, but no one's willing to say anything about it. And the point I wanted to make by that was, first of all, it's one way that the play kind of undermines the authority of written words and documents by showing that they can be manipulated. But the other thing is, I think it puts pressure on audiences about what are the ethical obligations for how we receive information and how we understand things that are given the authority of historical fact, in this case an indictment. This guy was a traitor and needs to be put to death. And I wanted to juxtapose that with a scene later on when Richard and Buckingham Buckingham is trying to get the citizens of London to all get behind Richard. And he says, "I bid them did they love their countries, God save King Richard. Did they so? No. God help me, they spake not a word, but like dumb statues. Or breathing stones stared each on other and looked deadly pale." I'm just interested in this as a moment of silence as political resistance, a moment in which what's called attention to is how you can, as an audience, as a collective of people, kind of resist political tyranny. So, again, I can say more about that if people are interested, but just for the interest of time, I'll skip ahead to note that the theatrical experience that Richard III provides alerts audiences to the fact that monarchical power does not ever exist aloof from the collective judgment of the people. Shakespeare's Richard chases after popular support. He doesn't ever catch hold of it. His eventual rise seems more a product of his ability to coerce key individuals among the nobility and the episcopacy, as well as the mayor of London. The vocal resistance to Richard offered by the many strong-willed female characters of the play represents a startlingly frank rejection of his claims and maneuvers. This is limited to a few aristocratic women who are related by blood or marriage to Richard. So perhaps a more relatable for audience members version of this would be the citizens at Guildhall, we just saw in that last quotation, who refused to acclaim him. Could be seen as significant insofar as it signals this diffuse unease and a reluctance to sign on to his agenda. So it's not surprising that when the 20th century playwright Bertolt Brecht wrote a play that drew heavily on Richard III to critique the emergence of Hitler, it was titled The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. Now, Shakespeare doesn't point us so clearly to a moral, least of all in his titles, but there is circulating through Richard III the sense that for all of Richard Gloucester's strange charisma, occasional tactical brilliance, his rise is indeed resistible. That he was briefly successful in attaining power and terrorizing his country is most often understood as part of this Tudor myth, a matter of providence. And there's a critic who calls it an angel with horns, this sort of paradox that God wanted to sort of do this house cleaning before the Tudors could be installed to care for the nation. If that's the case, if his evil was a necessary precursor to Tudor glory, then resistance to Richard would always be a futile gesture. But I have a hard time reading Richard III as a play that encourages passivity by implying that faith in the hand of God is the appropriate response to tyranny and corruption. Shakespeare may not have written Brechterian Lehrstücke or learning plays, but Richard III surely is meant to prompt thought about the social foundations of political power, more than it's geared to assure its audiences that the providential surface is the whole story. It's the performance elements of Richard III, I think, that best help us see around the play's providential facade to some of its other connotations, namely how Richard III provokes self-reflection in the live audience it was written to address. So I'm just going to return now as an end to where I started. So this quotation puts me in mind of that desire, but not the result of history and performance. Performance is, I think, different than a ghost, because performance offers something more like real presence, even if it is transient. So even as a performance of the past dissolves like a dream, I don't think audiences at Shakespeare's theater have to leave the theater like Odysseus is here, cut to the heart with grief. The play Richard III offered the pleasure of a fleeting contact and its reminder that history is an ongoing process. The past is alluring and we chase after it. We have to work to give it life and be vigilant about how we preserve it and refine it when new evidence or approaches call for that. And there is an element whereby we learn from it. And I'm trying to bring these things together rather than think about them separately now. Perhaps genocide studies is the most pressing modern example of why history is urgent, and of the urgency of preserving consensus about what can be objectively demonstrated. But there's also the entertainment factor, the joy in trying to commune with the disappeared times and people. Even when history is dark and upsetting, the thrill of imagined contact is powerful. The Elizabethan era was a particular moment in time when the stage was a popular phenomenon with a wide-ranging impact, and when plays about history were in popular demand. The history play harnessed its unique power to inspire self-reflection about history for this audience. So something like Hamilton aside, it's not clear if that's possible again. Film and TV, with their different formal dynamics of visuals on screen and that are recorded, are the predominant vehicles for the performance of the past today. But in Shakespeare's time, theater theorist Herbert Blau's vivid statement still had particular force, and I'm going to end with just his quotation here. The past always needs blood donors. The theater is a means of transfusion. I wish I'd wrote that line, but I have to say it was Herbert Blau. So thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Dr. Walsh. We have time now for questions. As is the custom, we open it first to students.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. I really enjoyed the lecture. So may I just give one emphasis on one of the summaries you made? And I have a question, but I think you answered that already. So I remember earlier you said, so theater performance is a pleasurable, imaginative reperformance of what is intrivocable, and with ethical and moral lessons. I think that basically summarizes everything, but I think I have a similar question to you. So what would be the boundary between history that is rooted in a narrative fact and the literature or theater that is beyond narrative fact?
Beyond, you mean something that there's debate about whether it's true or? Yeah. So, sure. I mean, your question puts me in mind of something that I don't really feel qualified to go into, although at some point I was going to try to say something about the if you're interested in movies, for instance, right, the Oscars we just mentioned, the Two Popes, right, that's one movie, the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, The Irishman. You got 3 movies that just came out in the last year, all of which are making pretty big and in many ways controversial claims on what's real and what can be represented. So you have a few, especially in the Tarantino Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which completely kind of rewrites a historical event as it's ending. And if there's a lot of pleasure in that, if you're watching it and you think, oh, I know how this is going, and then he gives a completely different ending and just doesn't apologize for it and just says, that's what I'm doing. And so the question, I guess, is there some danger in that? You know, we can say, okay, if you know that what he's doing is intentionally playing with chronology, playing with events, people who were murdered are not murdered in the movie, so it would change his alter his course of history in a way. Is that just kind of a playful intervention? I remember I used to read a comic book when I was growing up called What If, and it would have like scenarios of like alternative, counterfactual histories. So is there a kind of danger in that if someone watches something like The Irishman, the De Niro, Martin Scorsese movie, says this is what happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Most people don't accept that that's what actually happened, but if that's going to circulate on Netflix for time immemorial, is that going to be a way people come to understand it? And so I guess what I'm sort of working my way up to try to think about how the dynamics of that might be different now than in Shakespeare's era. I think now if someone watches a movie based on history and they have any questions about it at all, or they're very likely to go to Wikipedia and start to say, okay, what are the differences, historical, is there at least some sense of a controversy around that? In Shakespeare's period, you could theoretically go to the Chronicles, but I don't know if that was as kind of, those weren't kind of as handy as Wikipedia is. And so there's a different sense of what is the safety net underneath historical representation today as opposed to then. And so for me, I'm not as interested ultimately in the, what were the ethics of, say, Shakespeare in changing history for his own purposes, as the kinds of conversations I think his plays started and could inspire reflection on for his audiences about where does historical knowledge come from. So I think by making staging debates within his plays about how do we know what we know, I think he's at least helping people start to understand that there is a required critical sensibility within history, that you do need to, okay, so this is one representation of it, but this representation itself has people arguing over what is real and what's not. No, that did happen, no, it didn't happen. People are having that deliberate argument within the play, and without necessarily, and the play doesn't necessarily resolve it. And so when you have moments like that, I think that the play is, again, we can have a whole other discussion about this happened, this didn't happen. Shakespeare thought this was real, but didn't, or knew it wasn't or something. But I think that it's the kind of methodology of thinking about history that comes forward really powerfully in the plays. Oh, thank you.
Making me earn it. You could have met me halfway.
I know, I'm sorry. Hi, 2 quick questions. The first one has to do with the move from memory to written word. And my question is this something that scholars in the early modern field or in the literary field are finding as occurring in this early modern period? Because I'm a medievalist, and in my own field, the big work on that topic is M.T. Clancy's From Memory to Written Word, which sees that move as occurring earlier than the early modern period. And then my second question has to do with, I think, a point that I found very, very interesting in your talk, which is the referring to earlier work in a tetrarchy or in a series of texts. And I have a kind of a selfish question about it. There was a suggestion that Henry V, passages in Henry V, were referencing Shakespeare Apocrypha and Edward III. And what's kind of playful and interesting about that is we know that the real Henry V, when he was on the Agincourt campaign, was looking at the events and the actions of Edward III at Crécy. So you have a historical figure imitating, emulating his predecessor, also a historical figure, and then possibly you have a subsequent play referring back to another play within a generation or so. So of course the question that comes out of that is, would you likely have one playwright alluding to or referencing another playwright, or would they seem to be more comfortable referencing their own material, right? Like, I guess it's a question of intellectual property, even though it's an anachronistic question. So those are my two questions for thought. Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the second one. I think that I don't think they were at all shy about talking about each other's work. Sometimes there's a so-called war of the theaters that happens around that's referenced obliquely in Hamlet at one point when the players come to Elsinore. So an idea of direct reference and parody at different moments. Certainly Shakespeare is really in dialogue with Marlowe, both in a maybe serious way with Richard II, Edward II. What do those plays have to do with each other? That's a matter of a lot of critical interest and debate. Something like the Merchant of Venice and Jew of Malta, the way in which those two comment and speak back to each other. Some people look at an early play like Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus and think about a figure there like Aaron as a deliberate, the character Aaron is a parody of Marlowean overreacher or self-assertion. But if you believe in As You Like It, there's a maybe even reference to Marlowe directly, the dead shepherd who said about love at first sight. So there's, I think that they register. Ben Jonson is probably a little bit nastier about that, where he really likes to make fun of other playwrights for being bad and representing them on versions of them on stage and parodying their work. So I think that the idea that in both kind of serious or more parodic ways, the plays are all really talking to each other in ways that I think we can't ever really have a full conception of. We're missing so many plays, and we're missing such a sense of what the relationship was of the different theater companies to each other, how friendly, how rivalry, how serious it was. But I think that they are all constantly stealing from and imitating each other pretty openly. I mean, Ben Jonson wrote a play called Richard Crookback. It doesn't exist, but it was clearly his attempt to, okay, people want to see this character, I'm going to write a play about it too. So I think that there was constant kind of dialogue back. Going back to the first question about, I mean, I think this is really interesting about, I mean, we have to think about where does something like print come into play when you go from memory, oral to, so there are things like, okay, so if guilds keep manuscript history, oftentimes guilds, as you know, are like the center basis of a lot of chronicles. That's like they're keeping track of history, but what's the circulation of those? And then how does print sort of upend that? So I think that certainly, I'm always reluctant as early modernist to say anything was invented, because I know how much the early modern is less divided from the medieval as it was traditionally in periodization made out to be. But I do think something like the circulation of chronicles brings that to the fore again more. Okay, now more people, even when they start making these chronicles in pocket-sized editions so that they could be carried around. So if there's a wider circulation and accessibility, then that question of oral versus print comes up with a little more urgency. It's not a new question, but it's re-inflected. In the same way that something like some people talk about the internet now and they say, oh, people had these same debates about the printing press. And obviously we could argue about if it's a difference of kind or degree, but I think questions about oral versus written existed in manuscript culture, and then they existed maybe a little bit differently in print culture. And I would just say too, in Henry V, what I've been interested in that play at different moments is that in the play, someone talks about chronicles, not Henry Fluellen talks about the chronicle. He's like, in the chronicles it said this, and Alexander did that. But that idea that he's referencing the chronicles in a play about history kind of puts them together. And my question is does the play in that moment supersede the chronicle? As like, okay, Fluellen is this old-fashioned guy, and is the fact that he keeps citing the chronicle tell us that the history play is now where it's at? Yeah. Thanks.
Phil Devine. I understand why Odysseus wanted to embrace his mother, but there are episodes in history which you would think we would want to forget, but instead you get obsession with the Holocaust, for example, possibly beyond what is healthy. And furthermore, you have a school of historians which considers itself progressive, but is I don't know if it's intended, but its lesson, in fact, is we might as well give up on justice in a country like the United States and simply seek power, because justice, at least in a country like the United States, always has been and always will be a joke. How do these phenomena fit into your argument?
Right, so, take a second to think about that. I think that I guess I'd start with the idea that, and the Holocaust example is interesting because I think of when I was an undergraduate, I remember I took a German history class, and it was really became clear about halfway through that no one wanted to learn about Bismarck. Like, everyone was there because they wanted just to study that one slice. You know, this is a history that was supposed to go all the way back to the present, but it was this sort of perverse sense of, like, why is everyone want to focus on this very unpleasant part of history? And we could say the positive thing is, because we want to learn from it and we want to understand how to undermine it and recognize its signs coming back again. But there is a kind of lurid fascination that goes with it as well. And so that's maybe the unhealthy side of the desire for the thrill of contact, and almost like time travel narratives that I think history plays can provide people a pleasure similar to that. But the question of using history to try to recover, I guess, alternatives and alternatives to the present, or genealogies of justice or something. I think that's just, it's the necessary work that goes on alongside. I mean, I think that the pleasure and interest of history might drive, the pleasure of history as a mystery, as a kind of thrill, sort of drives us in it. But I think it's overlaid with an ethical obligation as well. But I don't know. I mean, I can't answer. I don't know how to answer the question about whether the United States is worth, you know, trying to figure out the history of justice for that. But I do think that the kind of didactic, moral version of history and the more visceral, exciting history is kind of like theme park. You know, you go dress up in Renaissance fair stuff or whatever. That idea of the people who'd like to do the war reenacting, all that. I think both of those things have to be together. Ultimately, again, I separate them out for the purpose of analysis, but you know, I think you need both. I think both are driven, but you don't want, you know, for the example of like Civil War enactors, I don't want people to get too excited about that idea of dressing up as a Confederate soldier. I'm hoping that there's some prompting of self-reflection on that as well, so that the whatever brings you to it in the first place, something is going to ask you to reflect on it as well.
I have one question myself, actually. I love that anecdote about the host full of ale and history, which is a good way of thinking about the Friars Club tour guides here, maybe, full of ale and history. No, I don't know. But it's fascinating to think about the Burbage and his identity as an actor condensed and displaced onto, you know, the historical figure of this king. I've had the experience just as a playgoer myself. If you return to the same theater, the Folger Shakespeare Theater in DC or the Blackfriars in Stanton, Virginia, and the first time you see a production and you see these characters, or you see these actors, and you return and they have a different role in a different play, you think, oh, I like that guy, or no. So is there anything in your research that you've seen from theorizing either terminologically or anything like that, this experience of just of association with, you know, these embodied figures and that relationship to whether it's Romeo becomes Richard III or vice versa?
Yeah.
And that phenomenon.
I mean, that once actors have any kind of celebrity status, I was just thinking of my mother went to see the Little Women movie, and she's talking about how Timothy Chalamet just does not measure up to whoever was in the one she saw when she was young. Like, that was a really handsome guy. That was a guy you could fall in love with. This Chalamet guy, you know, that she wasn't doing it for. So that idea of someone's fixed in your head as something, and I think it's interesting when you have some of these grand old actors like Garrick and so forth, who would be playing Hamlet into their 70s sometimes, and everyone made allowances for that because, well, that was just their part, and that's who you wanted to see in the part. I'm not sure if I have a good sense about what the term for that is, but it's something that comes up a lot too. I've been teaching a lot of film adaptation classes, and so we read the play Fences, and then we watched the Denzel Washington directed and starred version he starred in. And one of the things I was saying to the students is, so we read it and talked about it as a play, then we watched the film. And I was just saying to the students, like, well, try to ever read this play again and not hear Denzel Washington's voice saying those lines. Here we have just an incredibly charismatic guy with an incredibly memorable physicality and way of speaking and intonation. And it's almost impossible to ever read that play again after you've seen that movie and not have at least hear his voice in your head. And so I think that that's a general phenomenon of historical representation as well as adaptation or performance of a classic novel, or a classic play.
You're welcome to join us for refreshments right down the hall, but please join me in thanking Dr. Walsh.